This may appear to you like any other Chery Tiggo 8. However, this is the new entry-level model, which has a slightly less powerful engine and comes in at under 130,000 ringgit. And for a 7-seat SUV, you cannot deny that that is excellent value. Now, the Tiggo 8 that we have here now represents the entry-level model into the Tiggo 8 lineup, where the variants start with the Tiggo 8 that we have here, followed by the Tiggo 8 Pro, which uses a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, and then above that, although actually at the same price, is the Tiggo 8 PHEV. Now, for this entry-level model, power comes from a 1.6-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, which puts out about 290 newton meters and about 180-200 horsepower thereabouts. Not that much, but it is significantly lower than what we used to get from the Tiggo 8 Pro with its 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder. That power continues to go to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox. Now, the reason why this variant exists is twofold. Firstly, in order to bring the Tiggo 8 nameplate to a slightly more affordable, more approachable level, and also, more importantly, to address the sort of customers who are not interested in buying the most powerful 7-seater SUV currently on the market. That's why this car exists. More importantly, this 1.6-litre turbocharged powertrain does promise to be significantly more fuel efficient compared to the 2-litre Turbo 4 that we used to get from the Tiggo 8 Pro. Now, in terms of styling, you can't really tell apart the Tiggo 8 from the more expensive Tiggo 8 Pro, which starts at a retail price of 159,000 ringgit, whereas this comes in at under 130. That's because up front, you still get the huge sort of octagonal grille replete with its sort of brushed dark chrome surround, full LED headlights replete with scrolling indicators. And again, the front end treatment looks very similar to the more expensive Tiggo 8 Pro, but the devil is in the details. So for example, while you still get an illuminated Chery logo, which greets you every time you lock and unlock the car, we have lost the LED fog lights and the LED turning lights, which used to live down here on the corner of the bumper. The changes become a little bit more obvious as we go down the side, however, because as you can see, this car rides on slightly smaller alloy wheels compared to that of the Tiggo 8 Pro. So where the Tiggo 8 Pro rides on 19-inch alloy wheels, the Tiggo 8 rides on 18-inch alloy wheels, although they are still wrapped in Cooper tires, just like the cars that we have tested previously. Now, these tires are perfectly middle of the road and they were adequate to deal with the Tiggo 8 Pro, but because this car is slightly lighter and has a little bit less power and torque, I think that this is a slightly better pairing. We still get the TGDI badging here, as well as a little bit of chrome strip here, as well as chrome down here, as well as functional roof rails and more chrome around the windows, which again help to make this car look and feel like a much more significantly more expensive vehicle than it might suggest. Now, compared to vehicles like the Proton X90, the Chery Tiggo 8 is slightly smaller in terms of dimensions. It is a little bit shorter, but it is just as wide, although it doesn't ride quite as high. Although that said, I do still think that the Tiggo 8 has a relatively commanding presence on the road, which is where I think a lot of customers will be more concerned when it comes to buying their large SUV. But it is at the rear where I think it is most obvious that this is not the Chery Tiggo 8 that we were once familiar with. Gone is the full-width LED light bar, instead replaced with these full LED taillight units separated on either side, with Chery scripting in the middle and no chrome garnish up here on the boot lid. We've also lost the T-shaped brake lights. Instead, now you just have a third brake light here just as a singular strip. And of course, instead of saying 390T to denote 390 Newton meters, this now denotes 290 Newton meters of torque, again to differentiate this as a slightly more affordable model. Despite that, we still get quite a decent sort of rear bash plate here, as well as real exhaust exits on either side, which help to make this car look a little bit sportier. I appreciate the fact that these are not fake exhaust exits. I actually like the way the rear end is done up. In fact, this tail end actually looks, to me, a little bit more sophisticated compared to what you get on the Tiggo 8 Pro and the Tiggo 8 PHEV, although that may be a matter of opinion. Now, despite the fact that this is the entry-level variant and therefore the most affordable Tiggo 8 that money can buy, they haven't skimped out on certain features such as a powered tailgate, which means that pressing a button will reveal that this car has a capacious amount of space back here. With the third row folded down, there is more than enough room in here for 5 people's worth of luggage, even over a longer holiday. In addition to this, there is actually space underneath the boot floor to hide the parcel shelf as well as a bunch of smaller items, which means that even if you do need to load up the space all the way to the roof, there is at least somewhere for you to keep your parcel shelf. Now, folding up the third row of seats is very easy. You just pull on this latch and up they come. And this will show you broadly the amount of space you'd have if you use this car as a full 7-seater. Now again, a Proton X90 does offer more space, but this is generally par for the course for 7-seater SUVs. If you actually want more cargo space with all 7 seats in place, then unfortunately you have to step up into vehicles like the Hyundai Santa Fe or potentially the Chery Tiggo 9. But that said, given the fact that the majority of Malaysians use their 7-seater SUVs as 5+2s, meaning that this is the setup that they are most normally in most of the time, I think that this is decently practical. This is aided by the fact that there are hooks and tie-down points, rear air conditioning vents, as well as a 12-volt socket, allowing this rear end of the cabin to feel relatively cavernous. There's also a light up here on the ceiling, which means that anything that you put in here will be illuminated should you be trying to take things in and out at night. So overall, this does feel decently practical, although the one niggle that I will point out is the fact that despite that this car is being sold in a right-hand drive market, in Chery's right-hand drive hub, the button to close the boot lid is still on the left. It's a small thing, but most right-hand drive vehicles have it down here instead. Small oversight, but there we are. Now, before I touch on the driving experience, I actually want to talk about this interior a little bit. Now, the reason for this is because, surprisingly, despite this just being a different variant in the Tiggo 8 lineup, this interior is very, very different from the rest of the range. So the Tiggo 8 Pro, Tiggo 8 PHEV, and Tiggo 8 all have completely different cabins. And to me, funnily enough, I actually find that this Tiggo 8, this base level interior, to be a little bit nicer and a bit more ergonomic compared to the rest. For example, the infotainment screen might be a little bit smaller than what you get from the Tiggo 8 Pro and the Tiggo 8 PHEV. However, its placement and the user interface means that it's a lot easier to manipulate, especially when you're on the move. On top of that, while it might not be the biggest screen in the world, the size of it is enough for you to use your wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto and get the information that you need at a glance. More importantly, it's not like you need to use that screen for a bunch of other things either, because unlike in the other two more expensive Tiggo 8 models, the HVAC system actually gets its own screen a little bit further down in the center console, which is not only a touchscreen unit, which means you can use it to adjust where the air is being blown, for example, or to change your fan speed, etc. But there are also physical controls in order to adjust this car's dual zone climate control, which means that, again, this base level interior feels a little bit more ergonomic. And as if that wasn't good enough, there are also a set of physical buttons, an entire row of them in fact, that sit underneath the center air conditioning vents, which provide all of the necessary shortcuts to your most frequently used operations, the sort of things that you'd want to be able to manipulate while you're driving and while you're on the move. And I think that there is a certain degree of sensibility within this cabin that is just not present in the rest of the Tiggo 8 lineup, or in fact from other Cherys. I actually like the way this has been set up. The same goes for the digital instrument cluster, because while we do get a digital instrument cluster in other Chery models, the one that we get here, yes, it looks a little bit more traditional, and perhaps the refresh rate is not as high as you get on the plusher Tiggo 8 variants, but the information that it displays is displayed in a very crisp manner, which means that, again, you get all the information that you need at a glance. That very traditional layout means that you're never hunting, looking for the information that you want. It's all displayed exactly where you expect it to be. And more importantly, it is almost entirely bereft of gimmicks, which means that the graphics card and the processor that's running all of this isn't being overloaded, having to run 1,000 other different things. Instead, all it ever has to do is run the instrument cluster, which is nice. It's actually refreshing that all of this is that easy. And the ergonomics also continue to other controls. The steering wheel, for example, is actually shared with the much more affordable Tiggo Cross. However, Because this is an older design steering wheel, it has a bunch of physical controls, which means that, for example, setting your cruise control, adjusting your follow distance or speed, or adjusting your volume or changing track, or in fact manipulating the instrument cluster, all of that is done via physical controls as opposed to having those touch sensitive units that you get in like the Tiggo 8 PHEV. Once again, it just feels like this is a far more sensible interior. And that sensibility also extends into the second row, where naturally there is a ton of space for people if there are only 2 rows being used, with plenty of legroom and plenty of headroom for someone like myself, sat behind myself, and for the record I'm 170 centimeters. And even if you were to slide that second row a little bit further forward, because the floor is almost completely flat and because there's plenty of space for feet, it also means that you can make space for people in the third row to sit more comfortably. Now, speaking of the third row, I will admit that the space back there for the 6th and 7th passengers are not as generous as what you'd get from a Proton X90. However, it isn't exactly uncomfortable. The seats themselves are relatively supportive, if albeit mounted a little bit too low. And while you do get rear air conditioning vents with a blower control switch on one side, which means that you can adjust how strongly the air conditioning is blowing at you in that third row, unfortunately there are no power ports, no USB ports, only that 12-volt socket that you have to access from the boot, which means you actually have to reach behind to put in a little socket before you actually have access to USB ports. And in fact, even in the second row, there's only a single USB-A port. That's it. But if you ask me, it seems quite clear that this interior doesn't feel like they've cut corners. It's only if you're really looking at the details will you realize where it is that Chery's managed to save money on this more affordable variant. So for example, while both front seats are still power adjustable, they are no longer ventilated, although at least the power driver's seat does come with memory. We've also lost the boss switch for the front passenger seat, which means that adjusting it is now a little bit more challenging. You can't just reach over and adjust it from here. And you also don't get ambient lighting in the second row. The other thing that I've also noticed is the fact that this car no longer comes with metal tread plates on either of the doors. Forget illumination, there are just no tread plates at all. That I find to be a bit strange, but I don't think it's something that people will care about too much, particularly given the fact that, number one, they're tread plates, not many people actually pay attention to them, and two, you can probably buy aftermarket ones for not that much money online if you really wanted a set of metal tread plates. So overall, it doesn't feel like I'm in a cheaped out car in any way, shape or form. And this experience actually extends once you're behind the wheel. Now, I will admit that yes, this 1.6-litre turbocharged engine is actually less powerful than the 1.5-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder that you currently get in a bunch of Proton models, for example. So this car produces a little bit less power and a little bit less torque. But what I would like to point out is the fact that because the Chery Tiggo 8 is a little bit smaller and therefore a little bit lighter than the Proton X90, it feels like the power to weight ratio in this car is very well matched, it's very well suited. On top of that, while you might scoff at the idea of this large 7-seater SUV being powered by something as small as a 1.6-litre turbocharged engine, what seems very clear to me is that Chery has paid a special emphasis on smoothness. Now I say this because this 1.6-litre, as I mentioned, it's not the most powerful thing in the world, but 290 Newton meters is actually enough to get this car up and going. You want to get it up to motorway speeds, you need to overtake someone, you're trying to merge into traffic, you're fine. This 1.6-litre turbo is more than enough for this car. It doesn't come with the oodles of torque that the 2-litre used to, but this is, again, perfectly serviceable. More importantly, as it goes about its business, it is, as I said, incredibly smooth. Now, the 7-speed dual-clutch automatic is an engine that we've seen before, and this 1.6-litre turbo is actually shared with other vehicles within the Chery group, which means that this is not a unique setup. However, it seems that Chery Auto Malaysia has spent a lot of time ensuring that this powertrain package operates with a certain degree of smoothness that you simply wouldn't expect. So for example, when you're just driving about day to day, this 7-speed dual clutch automatic does an excellent job of mashing the gears together to a point where you cannot tell when the gears are changing at all. The only indication being the little gear selector indicator in the digital instrument cluster. Beyond that, you don't really know what's going on. On top of that, when you do need a little bit of get up and go, when you put your foot down, this dual clutch automatic is actually quite happy to drop 2 or 4 gears if necessary in order to get you into the appropriate torque band, which means that even though this gearbox is geared toward trying to get up to the 7th ratio as quickly as possible in order to minimize fuel consumption, it doesn't do so in a way that will leave you sort of squandering on the road, which is nice. This is very good. And what I find even more surprising is the fact that when you are on the motorway, this engine actually remains very, very muted. So it will get you up to speed in whatever urgency that you need it to do. That is all fine. But once you get up to your cruising speed, it swaps all the way up to the 7th gear, and then it just keeps the engine nice and quiet. And so you can cruise along at blazing motorway speeds without any noise from the engine room. And in fact, even when you're driving about in town, you can barely tell what's going on. It's sort of a very quiet, distant hum somewhere in the distance. Now, talking about driving in town, the suspension on this car has also been reworked in order to accommodate that smaller 1.6-litre turbocharged engine. One of the things that caught me off guard about this suspension setup is that, number one, it isn't nearly as floaty as you would expect from a Chinese car. In fact, it's surprisingly nuggety in the sense that I'm getting a lot of feedback from this powertrain, which means that I know exactly what it is that's going on. On top of that, despite it having pretty decent sort of reaction and pretty decent engagement in terms of being able to inform the driver, it doesn't do so in a way that compromises body roll, and it's not so stiff either that it feels uncomfortable within the cabin. This just feels like a very, very well judged suspension setup. It feels like the engineers at Chery have finally figured out what it is that Malaysians really want from their cars, and they're dialing in that suspension tune into every possible car that they can. And this Chery Tiggo 8 to me feels even more accomplished than the Tiggo 8 Pro, which then puts it on par with the ride and handling setup of the Tiggo 8 PHEV. Unfortunately, however, Refinement is not quite as good as you might expect or as you might want, particularly given the fact that the rest of the package of this car seems to be very adept. So for example, when you're driving at urban speeds, everything is generally fine. You don't really get a lot of wind noise or a lot of road noise at speeds under 80 kilometers an hour, unless you are on coarse-chipped surfaces like I am now. However, when the speeds start to pick up and it's time for you to start to maintain motorway speeds, unfortunately, much like the Tiggo 8 Pro, there is quite a bit of road noise that gets kicked up as a result of these Cooper tires. Now, I'm sure that if you were to get a softer compound tire from a slightly more reputable brand, like say Continental or Dunlop, then you might have a slightly quieter cabin experience, particularly when you're trying to cover distance. But unfortunately, as it stands, with the car as it comes out of the showroom, is going to be a little bit louder and a little bit more sensitive to road surfaces, because as you can tell, once you get onto a quieter, slightly better paved road surface, everything becomes nice and muted. Now, the other thing that's caught me by surprise about the Tiggo 8 is the ADAS system. Now, I have said a lot about Chery Advanced Driver Assist features, mostly to the tune that they are not as polished as you might necessarily want, particularly given the segments that these cars are competing in. However, it seems like Chery Auto Malaysia has taken that feedback on board and decided to work a little bit harder in order to ensure that this system performs a little bit better. Now, this car comes with essentially the full gamut of active safety features. It just doesn't have a driver monitoring system, and I think it doesn't have rear cross traffic alert, I think. But aside from that, it's still got autonomous emergency braking, it's still got adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, it still has a 360-degree camera, it still has rear exit warning, replete with little warning lights on the rear doors. It's got everything that you would need and want from a vehicle like this, which means that ultimately this is pretty well spec'd. However, the execution of these features have left me feeling very, very impressed, because Chery Auto Malaysia has actually taken the time to refine the way these systems work. Now, make no mistake, certain things like the follow distance on the adaptive cruise control remain a little bit hesitant, to say the least, because it likes to leave a nice big gap between you and the car in front, which when you're on the motorway seems to suggest the vehicle behind you that you are unable to keep up with traffic speed, when in reality you're just using ACC. However, in traffic, this system now works a lot better. It feels a lot less fidgety, it doesn't feel like it's second guessing itself, it understands how to maintain the distance very faithfully, and it does so in a way that mimics the way a normal person would drive on a regular basis. It seems like the smallest of things, the sort of thing that no one would really pay attention to, and yet Chery Auto Malaysia really has gone through every little bit that truly matters to try and make this feel like the best possible car that they can produce for under 130,000 ringgit. That is an important factor. This car is under 130 grand for a essentially fully specced out 7-seat large SUV with a 1.6 litre turbocharged engine, a full gamut of active safety features, and essentially all of the comfort and practicality that you'd expect from a vehicle like this. On top of that, all the materials in here are all very nice, lots of soft touch, lots of double stitching everywhere. It just feels nice. In fact, if you were to have presented this car to me, say 3 years ago, and said that this car is 145 grand, I'd believe you. And so the fact that they're able to bring this in for under 130 grand and offer this level of safety, practicality, space, and performance for this amount of money is truly impressive. Bear in mind that the Proton X90, before Proton took away all of the nice bits, used to cost about this much anyway. And I'd argue that compared to the pre-facelift X90, this is a far better car. However, if you are looking for a large 7-seater SUV and you are a little bit on a tighter budget, then of course there is the Proton X90, which has a slightly better judged ride, although the interior does not feel nearly as nice as this, and most importantly, Proton doesn't think that you are a worthy enough customer to enjoy any sort of active safety features, so you'll just have to deal with that. Alternatively, if you want something that is not a Proton X90 but is just as unsafe, at least in terms of active safety features, there is also the Jetour VT9, which is just, I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, just don't. Which means that at the end of the day, the Chery Tiggo 8 1.6 turbo does feel like absolutely excellent value for what it's putting forward. Once again, you have a comfortable, well-appointed, well-specified interior. You've got a punchy powertrain that is also decently efficient, being able to do under 9 liters to the 100 on a regular basis. Plus, the active safety features that you would expect from a modern car in order to keep you and your family safe as you take in long-distance trips and interesting adventures. This, to me, feels like an incredibly well-sorted, well-put-together package. This is not a car that's meant to light your head on fire. This is not a car that is meant to inspire the most engaging drivers. Instead, this is just a very, very well-judged product. And I have a feeling that if more people paid attention to this car, it might end up being a lot more popular. And if you are on the market for a large SUV within the sub 150,000 ringgit space, the Chery Tiggo 8 is most certainly one to look out for. In any case, that concludes our review of the Chery Tiggo 8 1.6 Turbo. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.